The Association of American Medical Colleges is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century. My name is Sandy, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator for today's event. I'd like to formally welcome the participants who are joining us today. Please note that today's call is being recorded and will be available online in 3 to 5 business days. If you experience technical difficulties with the web portion of today's program, please email aamc@compartners.com. All participant lines will be muted during this broadcast. If you are listening to the program over the phone and you need assistance at any time, please press *0 and an operator will assist you. This presentation will last up to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities during the webinar and at the end. You may submit a question at any time by typing into the chat box at the lower left corner of your screen and clicking on the send button. I'd like to direct your attention to the links box on the left side of the screen where the presentation slides are located for you to view, save, or print. Simply click on the link and a separate web browser window will open. This will not interfere with your viewing of the program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amanda Field, Science Policy Specialist at the AAMC. Amanda?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Sandy. And as she said, my name is Amanda Field. I work in the Scientific Affairs Unit at AAMC, in which my team and I focus on improving and communicating research and research training policy issues that affect our member academic medical institutions. The AAMC is excited to be partnering with the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, or FASEB, and I have here with me 2 partners on this project, Dr. Anna Roberts-Pilgrim, who is hosting this webinar with me today, and Dr. Teresa Ramirez. We bring to you this webinar series on several National Academies 2018 reports that are relevant to the biomedical community, which you see pictured here: the Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century, Open Science by Design, Breaking Through the Next Generation of Biomedical and Behavioral Sciences Researchers, the Integration of the Humanities and Arts with Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Higher Education, Branches from the Same Tree, and Sexual Harassment of Women, Climate, Culture, and Consequences in Academic Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The goal of this series is to not only relay the key findings and recommendations of the reports, but to provide the community with a chance to interact and to discuss their concerns over efforts to implement these recommendations at their own institutions. For this webinar, we will be focusing on the report Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century, which explores how well the current U.S. STEM graduate education system is meeting the full array of scientific needs in the 21st century. This report analyzes factors that have affected the training of scientists, including how innovations in research methods and technologies have changed, changes in the nature of STEM work, shifts in demographics, and expansions in the scope of occupations needing STEM expertise. Today, Study Director Lane Scherer will be summarizing the key findings of the report, and in the presentation we'll focus on the implementation of 2 essential recommendations: creating an incentive structure that supports quality mentoring, and building an institutional culture that values a full array of careers in the biomedical workforce. This webinar will also feature examples of institutional implementation of these 2 recommendations from Drs. Chris Fund and Angela Byers-Winston at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dr. Cynthia Furman at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. As Sandy mentioned, there's an open chat box that webinar participants can use to communicate with us and with each other, so please don't hesitate to enter your thoughts and comments throughout the webinar. And there will be several opportunities to provide your thoughts, concerns, questions, and tips on implementing the recommendations of that report. And now I'd like to introduce Lane Scherer, Program Officer on the National Academies Board on Higher Education and Workforce and Study Director for this report.
Great. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you all, and I wish I could see all of your lovely faces out there on the internet. I am pleased to be able to talk a little bit about the report on graduate STEM education for the 21st century. And let's see if we can get this queued up. And so the basis of the report is that the National Academies really thought it was time to revisit a set of issues that they had delved into in 1995, looking at graduate STEM education. The big idea behind all of it was not to say that graduate education is broken or that things are going wrong, but to really think about how the context of scientific research, higher education, and the workforce has changed since 1995. And so the report was chaired by Dr. Alan Leshner, the CEO Emeritus of AAAS, We had a very diverse set of committee members from across different types of institutions from all across the country, and we had generous support from our funders at the National Science Foundation, the Institute of Education Sciences, the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, and the Spencer Foundation. The report was released in May 2018, but we really got started back in September of 2016 thinking about a number of issues, and we'll move ahead to look at the scope of what the committee was looking at. And so one of the statement of tasks for the committee really outlines what the focus and the emphasis of the report was going to do. And so like most National Academies reports, we weren't necessarily, trying to figure out what was wrong, but really looking at the evidence base of what is happening in graduate education, what can we learn, and really if graduate STEM education in the U.S. at both the master's and doctoral level is considered to be, quote unquote, the gold standard for graduate education in the world, how can we ensure that that standard is being held high throughout the 21st century? And so one of the things that we looked at was graduate education and career paths, sort of what goes into that. So what are the policies, the programs, how do we get to ensure that all students are meeting both their educational and professional goals? Looking also at the labor market, so what do we know about the jobs that master's and PhD students are obtaining, and what can we do to ensure on the education side that students have the opportunities to get those skills that they're interested in having going forward. We also took a look at how the state of funding into graduate education really shapes the incentive structure and how graduate education works as an enterprise. Looking also at data. So we know this links back to the previous point, federal and state programs, but a lot of it is also around what sort of data are being collected. This is not just on sort of who is coming in and out of programs, which was also important, but what do we actually know about where students are going once they obtain their degree, go into their first jobs, and not just their first jobs, but throughout the trajectory of their career. Some of the other things, this is both the international implications of science. It's not just how students are getting that education, how are they learning to work within different cultural contexts, but then also, what sort of job opportunities are available to them going forward. And then thinking about different models in graduate education, blended opportunities, hybrids. There's fully online master's programs now, and so we're looking at the full array of different opportunities. And so one of the things that came up is what makes this report different. And I'll sort of flag a number of different things as we're going forward. But really at the bottom of all of it is this idea that we were really interested, and the committee was interested in thinking about students. And so the points that you see up here all really align around what is an ideal graduate STEM education for students. That's the big part of this. And so what makes this report different is we outline in the intro an ideal graduate STEM education, which articulates really what a system would look like if it was oriented around students. And so this includes core competencies, so both at the professional and sort of the research side of what students should be getting out of their master's and doctoral programs that really would tee them up for both exploring a number of opportunities, but then also having sort of the deep technical expertise that is really valued by employers, both in academic research, in government, nonprofits, you name it. It's ensuring that students are getting what they hope to get out of their education. And then the last 2 points, this need for culture change and the systems approach, these really get to what has to happen in the system to get to this vision of an ideal graduate STEM education. Culture change is sort of a big kind of unwieldy monster of a concept, right? It requires, as we put it, actions from every stakeholder. It requires a lot of dedication and commitment to progress over time. And while we articulate in the report a number of different things that the federal agencies can do, one of the things that we're really excited about is that we also articulate different things that can happen at the institutional level that deans and chairs can be thinking about. And we also talk about what students themselves can do as they're thinking about their future. It's not to say that they have to move the entire system, although they are very smart and very capable. But, given where grant funding is, given the incentive structure, they might not be best positioned to do, that whole lifting themselves. But there are, at an individual level, things that they can be doing to be thinking about how they can set themselves up for success in their careers. And so speaking about success and setting ourselves up, the National Academies wanted to do something a little bit different with this report, and a number of the reports that you have heard from in sort of the overview session if you attended it, and you might hear going forward. But we really want to make sure that this report is getting into the hands and is a tool for the people who are really equipped to use it. And so we are doing things like webinars. We're also going to campuses across the country, professional society events. This is more of a bragging point for me. By the end of this month, this is actually our 25th event since May 30th when the report was released. And so we are going out there. We're, trying to make sure that we're making it available to anyone who can use it as a tool for change. And so, as we go forward throughout the spring and hopefully into next fall, if you are interested in having the National Academies do something in person, something at a professional society meeting, just coming to campus and meeting with student groups, doing a big public event, please contact me. My email is here. It'll pop up again later. You can Google my name. It usually comes up. I think I'm the only lane chair, definitely the only lane chair at the National Academies. So we are definitely interested in hearing from you. And if, virtually if cost is an issue, if time is an issue, so we can be really flexible, which I will just say that the National Academies is not known for, but we are capable of it. So just don't discount us too soon. But to get into sort of a lead-in into the rest of what we'll be talking about today, the report in sort of the central part of the recommendations really gets into, several different areas as graduate education really spans not just where the students themselves are working. And so the report recommendations really look around how are departments thinking about graduate education? Is it really in service of what is best for students? Some of the things that are discussed in the report are recommendations around the curricula, what is involved in a dissertation, if sciences is more and more being conducted in teams, but the dissertation, which is sort of the unit that you're supposed to come out with, is done individually. What does that mean? And what are other ways that you can really operationalize teamwork and give credit for the skills that people are hoping to get further on? Some of the other things that we looked into, professional development opportunities. So one of the things that the report recommends is this integration, looking at modifying the curricula, getting into, what is essential, but also knowing that students will have a broad variety of interests and that all those interests can't be captured necessarily in the core of what they're doing. But that's where institutions and professional societies can really look to have other opportunities to make sure that students are getting the full course of what they're looking for in career exploration. So maybe it's, working with big data, getting to know alumni and what they're doing through different careers, other professional skills, oral communication is really important, but maybe if it's PowerPoint or, more in-depth specific skills, that's where professional development opportunities can really be useful. We also wanted to look more toward employers, and this is on the industry side, that we think that there can be more communication from employers back to institutions and more of a two-way dialogue about how can we build, project-based learning or other experiences that give students the opportunity to understand what other careers look like and to build up sort of a understanding of the skills that they would need to be successful. And then finally, this is one that's very near and dear to my heart, is looking at mental health and wellness for all students. And so this is making sure there's an environment that really attends to ensuring diversity, equity, inclusion for all students, both sort of international and cross-cultural in a global sense, but then also first-generation students who are tending to families if they're, on either side, parents or children, people who are veterans, people who come from different backgrounds. And so the report really gets into that, and we're hoping to do a follow-up study. Hopefully just stay tuned for more information on that. But that is sort of a big overview, and now we'll be moving more into an interactive part of the webinar, and I will hand this over to Anna.
Thanks, Lane. You know, I wish I had this report when I was in grad school. This is great. So as I mentioned, as Amanda had mentioned, my name is Dr. Anna Roberts Pilgrim. I'm the Science Policy Fellow at FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biologies, where we advance health and well-being by promoting research and education in biological and biomedical sciences through collaborative advocacy and service to our societies and their members. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions about, you know, the overview, Lane, which was really well done. Okay, I think we have one. How can we reconcile students' desire to do internships outside of their research and the fact that they receive funding to do research from their PI's grants? It's sort of a double-edged sword, right?
It is a double-edged sword, and I think this gets back to the challenge with the incentive structure. A principal investigator is really, you know, as much as they can care about the development of the individual student, it becomes really challenging for that PI then to make sure that student's needs are getting addressed. There are some exciting things that are happening with external funding. The National Science Foundation has provided something called Intern as a Dear Colleague letter that can provide up to $50,000 in supplemental funding to existing awards to allow students to take up to 6 months, I believe, of an opportunity to get a non-academic research-related internship. So, you know, if there's funding that can be provided through industry employers, through others, there can be ways to supplement, you know, and to alleviate the pressure off the PI to get to more of a place of mutual interest instead of pitting sort of how the PI's funding structure is working against where the students might be wishing to go. There's still a question that we get around how do you sort of recoup the productivity of that student when they're gone. One of the things we have heard, I don't have a lot to point to as far as research, but the students often come back from those experiences with such deeper tools, whether they be really technically focused or sort of broadly in their understanding of how the research is fitting into a broader picture, that they've actually said, you know, even though they were gone for a little bit, when they come back, it ends up being such a benefit to the research that we were doing because of the exposure that they received. So there's almost this sort of human capacity element to it as well.
And that's open to grad students and postdocs?
Intern?
Yes.
The DCL for intern, I would check the National Science Foundation. Each directorate has a slightly different set of requirements. It is, to my knowledge, open to graduate students only, but most of them it's master's and PhD, but I would recommend going to NSF to look for that.
Well, thank you very much. That's great information. So we're going to talk more about this, and you're going to go into our first recommendation, which I'm really excited to hear about.
Let's see if we can move this forward. Oh, okay. So this is back to Amanda again, and we would like to emphasize that we really want to hear from our participants. We want to hear from you. We want you to talk to each other about what implementations you've tried, what barriers you see. So you can see here we have a poll set up for you. We are curious to see where our participants are at right now. So our first recommendation that we're going to be discussing is creating an incentive structure that supports quality mentoring. So we're really looking for quality mentors at our institutions, and so we're wondering in our audience if your institution has no plans to implement this recommendation, your institution has plans, your institution has already started the implementation, or perhaps you don't know. And while you're filling out these poll questions, we're hoping that you will chat with us in the chat box, again at in the lower left, discussing our discussion point, what barriers exist at your institution right now to start implementing this recommendation. And also any other questions you have. So as you fill out the poll, I can see some numbers coming in. This is very exciting. We can go ahead and start with a question we already got during the overview from Stephen Wendell. And the question is about internships and the risk of creating a credential arms race, adding even more to what I think trainees have to have on their CV or resume before they start their next job. So I'm wondering, Lane, if you have any thoughts on that.
Right. I think that's a really interesting point. And one of the things that we have heard around, especially for biomedical, between this report and then the report Breaking Through, which really focused on biomedical and early career behavioral scientists, is this sort of what is the role of the postdoc? How has it sort of gone from its intention as an additional educational and training experience into this sort of additional credential that really is necessary for individuals to get that first position? And for others, I'm not sure how an internship will I'm not someone who's going to make a lot of predictions around that. I do think it's a valid concern. One of the things that has come up over and over again with internships is access to funding. We mentioned this a minute ago, and that can often really put folks who have to be working, who can't take time away, it can put them at a disadvantage. I know particularly in the undergraduate space, unpaid internships, there is a concern that as those become more of sort of a signal to the employers in the labor market, if they're unpaid internships, I come from an English art history background, all of the internships are pretty much unpaid, and then it becomes, it only then is eligible for people who have the money to be able to afford to do that. And so I think going into this, how can we be very thoughtful and intentional about designing experiences that don't necessarily lead to that? But I think one of the other things is I wouldn't say that, arms race is, I do think, a metaphor that we can use, but one of the other things that came up over and over again in graduate education, especially with students, is this sort of talk about an undocumented curriculum. So, this might be something that is already contributing to people getting jobs, and so if we can sort of lift up the veil and say, make it a little bit more transparent so that way more students can have an understanding of what goes into getting these jobs, because right now, especially at science policy, it's a little opaque. So.
Thank you, Lane. I see from our poll that we have 28% of our participants that have answered the poll have no plans to implement. 20% plans to, 8% have already started, which is a low percentage. This is why we're trying to spread the word of how to do that. It's exactly the purpose of this webinar. And 44% don't know. So we have one comment from Sharon about she selected C at their institution because they are including participating in voluntary mentor training as one activity where they have already started to implement. So now we're going to go ahead and move on with Lane is going to go into more depth about this recommendation for creating an incentive structure that supports quality mentoring. She's going to give us a couple of tips from the report, and then after Lane, we'll be hearing from our institutional speaker to give us more tips about how we can implement. And I'd like to remind you that throughout, we would like to be hearing questions and comments from you that you can share with each other and with us, so please keep commenting, and go ahead, Lane.
Wonderful. So the recommendations on mentoring was something that came up very early in the conversations with the committee. And so the way that we structured the report, you'll see there's some numbers here. And the only reason I bring those up is Chapter 3 is all about cross-cutting issues. And so while there has been a lot of conversation around, what mentoring means in the doctoral space, we also wanted to make sure that it was something that we really focused on in the master's space, because we do see the master's as a space where people who could go on to get a PhD could really benefit from additional mentoring. And so the two things that we really came around is that getting back to the incentive system, there aren't really strong, let me restart. There isn't right now a good codified way to reward effective teaching and mentoring in the system as it is. From what we've heard, a lot of the advancement policies between hiring, appointment, promotion, and tenure are really not focused around rewarding folks who dedicate a lot of time to teaching and mentoring. While there is a lot of time that might be absorbed by an individual who is dedicating time to this, it becomes a challenge because it's not something that then gets picked up into decision making later on. The second thing that we heard a lot on and that we made a recommendation around was around the support. It isn't to say that there aren't people who sort of are doing the best that they can and really have their students' interests at heart, but it's another thing to say that the institution has a responsibility to be providing faculty at all stages of their career with different opportunities to get an understanding of teaching and mentoring. Different generations come in, how does texting work in terms of mentoring relationship? There are different things that will necessitate sort of refresh courses on, mentoring and how to be interacting with students in a way that is supportive and appropriate. And so we think that institutions ought to be thinking about how they can provide support to their faculty around this as well. And one of the things that doesn't show up here, but we'll get into sort of the key takeaways, is how much mentoring matters. For doctoral students in particular, the length of the time that they're in an institution is quite a bit longer than for a master's, and so it's incredibly important for students to have a sense of, what is that relationship, what can they get out of it, and, how valuable it is to their time in academia. So mentors and advisors. So one of the things that the report did that we thought was critically important was this division between what a mentor is and what an advisor is. And again, these are words, these are ways that we describe the concepts of, sort of a principal advisor on the academic side, and mentor can be used a little bit more broadly. But it's also to say that institutions can help set up those expectations. It is incredibly important to have clear guidelines, to understand and to communicate, to know what your resources are, to know how to refer students to other resources on campus. It's not to say you have to be everything to everyone all the time, but having a good understanding of what else is available can help a mentor or advisor sort of offload some of those responsibilities. Again, getting back to incentives and recognition, one of the things in particular that I'll bring up is that for thinking about diverse, inclusive, and equitable environments, one of the things that came up over and over again was that people who are persons of color, women, often get asked to take on sort of the mentoring load for a lot of women who come into, the particular lab or the department, or anyone else who looks like them. And then the additional emotional sort of energy that is expended on that is also then another thing that does not get put into the incentive and recognition system, and is something that departments and institutions should be aware of in terms of what their overall climate and culture, what sort of signals are they sending. And then finally, looking again, networks of support. Students should be able to, look to alumni, to look to administrative staff who, really understand sort of the logistics and the procedures. There are a lot of institutions are made of people, and there are a lot of people, inside and outside of academia that students can be looking to for support. I think, different institutions have guides for students and thinking about how they can build their networks. But one of the things that I'll say is the graduate education report, while it recommends mentoring, and while we thought a lot about mentoring, we don't really necessarily get into exactly what needs to be done that makes a good mentor, because we were really looking at another National Academy study to really sort of fill in that gap and look to the research. And so from here, I will turn it back over to our hosts, and we can continue to move forward and hear from our wonderful colleagues.
Thank you, Lane. I just want to say again, keep giving us your questions. We're going to hear from our next speakers before we move into questions, but keep bringing them in, and we'll get to them after our next speakers. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have Dr. Chris Fund and Dr. Angela Byers-Winston, who are experts in mentoring, and I'm sure have all kinds of excellent advice for our audience. So please, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for the opportunity. So what we thought we would do is I was going to share one thing that we thought might be interesting to the conversation today to start thinking about ways that institutions can think about this recommendation and address it. And as we saw from the poll, about 3/4 of folks are really still saying they're not sure what's going on or they don't have specific plans. And so we hope to provide some concrete ideas for you to consider. So I'll share that, and then Angela will talk about another exciting opportunity of resources that will be available to you. So just a couple months ago, we had the opportunity in partnership with the AAMC, the Boroughs Welcome Fund, and the National Research Mentoring Network to host a workshop that really focused on ways that institutions could optimize research mentoring relationships for doctoral and postdoctoral scholars. And our colleagues partnered on this across the country, and I know some of them are on the call today, so I want to acknowledge them here on the slide. And what I'm sharing with you on the next slide is a compilation of ideas that came from individuals across 20 institutions. And these were folks who, some of them ran career services offices, some of them ran postdoc and graduate student programs, some of them were faculty and had primarily focused on their own mentoring. And I won't go through all of these because, as was mentioned, the slides will be available to you. But as you're starting to think or advancing your own efforts, this compilation, I know from my own work, was really useful in thinking about places to start, some very early on the landscape and some more advanced. So a couple I want to point out, the very first one is some folks were just hosting a mentoring summit to raise visibility of the issues and talk about what some of the possibilities were and getting buy-in across their institution. Towards the middle of the list were ideas about including mentor training in department, division, or program assessments as something to check in on. Another was requiring mentor preparation and training for those who want to serve as trainers, and we know that this is one requirement being put forth by NIGMS at NIH with the T32s. And the other one I just want to point out is just a general increase in the visibility of mentoring and preparation for effective mentoring. So at the bottom, folks were saying just making mentoring efforts more visible on institutional websites or indicating on department program websites which mentors have engaged in training and preparation. So these are just a compilation of ideas that came from many institutions and might be helpful to folks as they start to think about addressing this requirement and these suggestions made forward. Well, not requirement, but the suggestions made forward in this report. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Angela Byers-Winston, who will share another idea with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, and to the rest of our colleagues on the phone. We're super excited to have an opportunity to share with you some of the ways that you can take advantage of some efforts at the national level, in addition to the great work that Lane is helping to spearhead with the graduate STEM education. That Board on Higher Education and Workforce has been quite busy at the National Academies of Science, and we have now undertaking another project on the science of effective mentoring in STEM with 2 M's to capture the academic medical context of mentoring as well. And so in October of 2017, we began a 2-year consensus study. We want to acknowledge the support and funding from the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Howard Hughes Medical Institute, as well as some funding from the National Academies Golf Report. And we have an effort now to really collate the best evidence and knowledge of practices and programs that are effective in mentoring individuals from historically underrepresented groups in STEM fields, true to the gold standard that we're used to looking at. By the National Academies, we will issue a final report of the consensus study by the end of October 2019. We also are doing something different in this effort, and in addition to creating this compilation of the best knowledge of practice and programs for effective mentoring in STEM, we will also create an online interactive guide that will help our colleagues like you all on the phone to be able to access the knowledge about indicators of effective programs and practices that can be adapted both for institutions and departments as well as individual faculty members. The last thing I'll say is that we are systematically gathering wonderful input from great, brilliant colleagues like you all from around the country. There are several workshops that have already been conducted. One that's still coming forward in February 2019, and several listening sessions, including those at AAAS, the National Society for Black Engineers, and other professional societies that you might be interested in. And so if you would like to know more about any of these opportunities and ways for you to create input and give us some of your ideas about effective mentoring practices and programs, feel free to contact us at that email link at the bottom of this slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris and Angela. This looks like an excellent report. I want to say thank you to our partners in National Academies for caring so much about our trainees and mentoring specifically. So, well, we're not there yet. So if we have any questions, we can go back and start with Caitlin's question, and this is for anybody who wants to answer. Caitlin works in career services, and she's wondering what role her office can play in regards to these recommendations.
This is Lane. I'll take the first crack at that. I think for career services, one of the things that you might want to keep in mind is that there's such a diversity of careers. You don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. There are great professional societies out there. There are great resources that already exist. And so I think almost being, a good funnel to making sure that you have an understanding of what's out there, connecting to alumni, connecting to fellowship officers who are at the National Academies who do AAAS fellowships, and just having that good network established and being more of a connector, since there are so many different opportunities, that could, I think, be almost a more valuable role than necessarily having all the information at your fingertips yourself. But I'd invite Chris and Angela, who've mentored a lot of folks and are thinking about this as well, what you might have in mind.
Thank you, Lane. I'd like to quickly add, Caitlin, as a person whose background is specifically in career counseling, I'm glad you asked that question. And I would suggest that you also think about the ways that you probably already have done but could continue to build the knowledge base of the mentors and the faculty working with the students to understand their role in facilitating career exploration and consideration for our students. Many of the faculty that Chris and I have surveyed and our colleagues have surveyed in our qualitative studies of mentors don't believe career development facilitation is part of their role as a mentor. And so I think your office can play a key role in equipping more mentors to have these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for your comments. I'm curious for Angela and Chris, if you've started to implement any of these ideas at your own institution and how those are working.
Well, I can take that one. So, it's very interesting at your own institution. So we've been working on efforts across the institution with many, many partners for a long time. Much of the initial work on mentor training that we've been involved with started here at Wisconsin over 13 years ago. Angela's been working in career development and STEM education efforts from her perspective on campus for a long time. And many of them have been taken up in the sense that we have a funded position on campus that coordinates mentor and mentee training for those working with grad students and postdocs and undergrads. It's linked to many summer programs. But as on most campuses, those are still not, it isn't across the entire institution. And so actually in the last 6 months has been some really exciting progress at now the institutional level, besides kind of funding, supporting those positions, of really thinking more broadly about surveying graduate students to really get a sense of what is needed, and Angela's been part of that work. From our provost office, really thinking about what we could be doing from a central campus office in terms of faculty mentoring and advancement and making it count in promotion and tenure. Even things like not calling mentoring committees for faculty mentoring committees if that's not what they are. And so especially in the postdoc office here and in the graduate programs is some of the new requirements like the T32 is really causing a lot of revisiting of opportunities. And since we have a lot of local expertise, we're really excited to expand those efforts. But there's still so much work to be done, even in a place like Wisconsin, where we have people who've been working on this for a long time. So I say that in a sense of to be encouraging to everyone is that you can have resources or not resources, or have experts or not experts, and still be somewhere on the landscape and move to a next step. Angela, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I think we have some great efforts, as you mentioned, Chris, here that could be considered in other places, and that is really starting to foreground some of the roles of the career services offices that can be more STEM specific. Just at a culture change perspective, I think that many of our career service offices are underappreciated because we haven't done a good job in really linking ourselves into the STEM space and the STEM discourse. And so I think anything that the career services offices can do specifically to raise their visibility of how they can support the academic and career success and planning of our graduate students in particular would be fantastic.
Thank you. I just have one follow-up question. We're running low on time, so we can have fast answers, but I know that faculty do not always see themselves that they need to be trained, or that, and they also may feel that it is an obligation, one more obligation that they have to fulfill, and so how can we encourage them to thoughtfully participate in an effective manner?
This is Lane. I mean, the National Academies reports really does not want to say that faculty aren't doing enough. It's really to say that the incentive structure that they're working in does not really put enough weight towards those considerations. And so this is a place where I think that the leadership at institutions, at our federal agencies, need to be thinking about how to adjust these incentives. There might be other ideas too. Chris and Angela, I don't know if you have any short comments before we move on.
Chris, I know you have some great ideas about engaging folk in training.
Yeah, so I agree with Lane. I'll just make, because I don't know we want to move on, is I think that really it's moving away from talking about this conversation in terms of training and having faculty think that they don't have skills in this area, but really moving towards optimizing their relationships, both in ways that are informed by evidence they may not be aware of, or spaces, just like Angela was saying, career development. What is your role? Have you thought about it? There's a whole literature out there. Who can you connect with? So really optimizing, and also understanding that as we all work to diversify the scientific workforce, we are working with very different types of trainees, and that for many of us is a new scenario, and so we can all benefit from optimizing our practice for the benefit of diversity. So I think those are two tacks that I would encourage folks to try, and as well as other things that they think would work in terms of faculty recruitment into these efforts.
Thank you, Chris. I really like the idea of promoting optimizing rather than training. That sounds much more uplifting. So we have our next poll. We're just wondering from our audience, after discussing the implementation, do you think it is more likely that you and or your institution will be able to implement these recommendations? We'll give you just a moment to fill out the poll and ask any other questions that we may be able to get to later in the webinar. We do have one question. What are some creative names that have worked for you to get faculty in the room? Well, we have optimizing. Are there any other specific names? If anybody wants to chime in on the chat with their own names, that's a really good question. Or
lunch.
What I'll do is actually, this was one of the topics that was dealt with in the FASEB 2, a Future of Biomedical Science Graduate and Postdoctoral Training Conference, about kind of ways to sell it, including call it training. It's training, but don't call it that. I'll put that link in the chat room because it has a lot of ideas, and that way we can move on.
Okay, thank you. That's perfect. And we also have enhancing the productivity of your lab from Cynthia, our future speaker in the webinar. Thank you, Cynthia. I like that. So just from the poll, you can say that, 53% of respondents have said they're more likely to. So that is very encouraging. Thank you so much. And also thank you for your honesty for those who say no and not sure. We want to know the truth, so please don't hesitate to tell us what you're really thinking. And we're going to move on to our next recommendation. So our next recommendation from the report is about building an Anna, go ahead. Okay, so building an institutional culture that values a full array of careers in the biomedical and medical workforce. So again, same question as before. Is your institution planning to implement, does not plan, or you don't know? And if you have anything you want to add into the chat about implementing, or any barriers that you have found to implementing a recommendation like this, please go ahead. We have some numbers coming in. It looks like a higher number of institutions have started to implement than before from our respondents.
Thanks, Chris.
Yes, Chris has just added her white paper, so thank you, or the white paper.
I love watching the poll numbers coming. It's like watching the election. Okay, so we have about 11% of our webinar participants saying that their institution has no plans to implement. 20% say their institutions do have plans to implement. That's encouraging. 65% have already started implementation. 67%, that's excellent. And 5% of the webinar participants don't know what the plans are for their institution. So that's good feedback. So we're going to head on to our second recommendation with Lane in the interest of time. Lane is going to look at career exploration, which is an excellent topic to recommendation for our final recommendation.
Great. So I think one of the things that I'll bring up here is there was a lot of overlaps and a lot of parallels between sort of how the report approached mentoring and then also the career exploration side, which is not surprising. None of these things happen in a vacuum. And so looking at the array of recommendations, we really wanted to, in the report, as I mentioned before, Chapter 3, so this 3.6, that is looking at sort of both doctoral and master's level. Recommendation 4.2 is really pendet master's students, as it suggests. And then the final recommendation here is looking at PhD students, but they all sort of hit on the same things. the recommendation about the dynamic graduate STEM education system is really thinking about if kind of our new state of normalcy is a state of change, if things are always going to be updated, if sort of the rate of change is accelerating, then institutions of higher education and the way that we think about, how do we prepare individuals for a profession, whether it's academic research or beyond academia, they're going to change pretty frequently. And so the way that, the sort of depth and the understanding of what goes into a PhD and a master's might have to be, sort of reframed, not completely redone, but rethought of as these things continue to shift. And then so thinking about master's and PhD students, both of these are basically the same recommendations, but just knowing that sort of the makeup of a master's program versus a PhD program are a bit different. We wanted to make sure that we reiterate them in both, since they both, we wanted to attend to the specific needs of master's students versus PhD students. And so thinking about, the big takeaways here, you can't start early enough. And so I would say in parallel to mentoring, these conversations should actually really be starting before someone even thinks about graduate school. And so looking at folks who are working with undergrads and who are looking at the future of who goes into graduate programs, these are the sorts of conversations that can happen in the beginning. Are you thinking about graduate school? These are all of the options. It's not just, you seem really good at academic, at research. Do you want to end up doing, basically what I'm doing? Making students aware of the full range of opportunities of a graduate degree can actually probably bring in more people, since there are so many options that might be, more appealing than, simply going into academic research. Not that that isn't great, but more options can mean more pathways going forward. Echoing what we heard from Chris and Angela, supporting all career pathways and sort of removing that stigma around seeking, jobs that are not tenure-track faculty positions can really be one way that institutions, both mentors, but the department can also signal through their career resources and through other, alumni sessions how valuable all jobs are. Getting into, this was mentioned earlier, it's not mentoring and advising, it's also referring. So making sure faculty feel comfortable with their own boundaries. It's okay to say, hey, I don't really know much about this, but here are some places that you might want to start looking. It can signal to, the students that, this is valuable and there are places to look, and that there are other people who might be valuable resources for them going forward, both on campus and I think off campus as well. Getting into institutional networks and connections, again, I think alumni, look at your business schools, look at your law schools, look at a lot of these other places on campus that really leverage those alumni networks. Also, I was a university fundraiser, so engaging your alumni and employers around can also lead to other opportunities that can be really beneficial. The University of Michigan had a very large capital campaign, Go Blue. I just have to slip that in there almost every time I talk about anything. And then finally, foraging for resources is something that I've really come around to. Just almost, both the committee recommended this, but students have a lot of their own agency. They can really be looking, they can be proactive and looking across, things virtually through professional societies to find their own opportunities. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, we have these, resources, but they don't get used. Some of that, again, is getting back to a stigma around, I can't apply for that funding because I'm not allowed to leave, my research, unit. That is also a different problem. But there are a lot of things out there that students can be looking for and building networks amongst their peers to be able to sort of get to the next level. But I do think there are a lot of exciting things that are happening on the ground, and I'm looking forward to getting an update from our colleagues at UMass to hear some of the things that they're looking into and what they can recommend that institutions, students, faculty can be looking for.
So, Lane, here's a question that we have. You talked about mentoring, advising, and referring. How do you get PIs to refer?
So I think, again, it's always a little bit of a challenge thinking about how to, leverage an entire group of people like faculty that are not monolithic. But I think, resources and letting, students be able to ask their faculty, how can you refer me? So it can also be student-led, not just faculty-led in that regard. But it can be a challenge.
great. That's a great answer. Okay, we're going to move on to implementation. In our chat box, I'd like our listeners to give us any questions they have about or how they're implementing this recommendation at their institute. And while you send your questions, we're going to listen to Dr. Furman, Assistant Dean of Career and Professional Development at UMass Medical School, and her colleagues, Dr. Mary Ellen Lane and Dr. Spencer Fenn, and how they built an institutional culture that values a full array of careers in biomedical and medical workforce through the BEST program.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm Cynthia. I'm the person in the middle circle here on your screen. My colleagues Mary Ellen Lane, our dean, and my colleague Spencer Fenn, assistant director in our office, are on the call but won't be able to participate audio-wise, so you'll have to settle with me. So I'm in the Center for Biomedical Career Development within the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. And our center takes a scholarly approach to addressing the PhD career development needs for our trainees. UMass Medical School is a freestanding public medical school. It's located midway between Boston and Amherst in Worcester, Massachusetts, right in the center of the state. We have about 300 PhD students and about 300 postdocs, and all our focus on the biomedical sciences. So like many universities, until 2014, we had little offered on our campus for career development of these trainees. Like ours, many campuses are investing in career development right now, as you know, but even when there are programs tailored to biomedical PhD needs, often students don't participate in programs, or they delay participation until they're close to graduation. And often we'll hear from students comments like they wish they had participated earlier, they wish they'd started networking or thinking about things earlier on. As Lane had mentioned, it's really important to start early. We're still up against this national culture that values productivity and, in many cases, academic research careers at the cost of student-centered, proactive career development. So at UMass Medical School, we decided to try an experiment. We wanted to shift the culture on our campus towards students taking early and informed action by integrating career development directly into the PhD curriculum. So we're basically very explicit, right? By having this built into the required curriculum, we're stating that career development is a core part of PhD training for all trainees on our campus. So we did this across multiple competency areas in professional development. So this includes presentation skills and writing skills. But in this short time we have, I'll tell you about what we did for career and research planning as a competency area. So if you think about adding new requirements to your curriculum, it has to be time efficient because no one likes new requirements. So in this diagram, you can see some ovals. Each oval stands for 2 hours or less of interaction with the students in the classroom or in person with them. So we really wanted to minimize classroom time, and we thought, well, we can do this by spreading things out across the full length of their training and having consistent and deliberate messaging whenever we interact with the students. And we thought that then we could shift culture and have a big impact, not necessarily on walking them through what all careers are, but more an impact on their mindset and their attitudes towards self-agency and their career development. So instead of hosting one kind of upfront course, that front-loaded career development concepts and skills, we integrated lessons and activities across the full span of PhD training. So from here you can see the first interaction is during the interview before they're even admitted to the campus for their PhD program on through their 4th or later years until graduation. So students don't like requirements either. So we wanted to ensure that each lesson was highly relevant and very timely to things that mattered to them. So we defined our learning objectives up front for what we wanted them to gain across their PhD training in this competency area. And then we identified times in training when students are using the skill or in a place where they could learn some of these things and practice them. And we wanted to give them strategies and opportunities to help them. So we have examples for that for presentation skills and writing skills. In this case, for career planning, we really wanted to think about how we could intertwine career development and thesis research. So basically help the students see how their career development is linked to their thesis research and kind of get away from the notion that, on the side you do your career development and the rest of the time you do your thesis research. We wanted them to see the connections without blending them away. So the early lessons in the green box focus on kind of the value and the interesting nature of a variety of biomedical career paths and helping to set the tone for them that our campus is really excited about the many opportunities they have in front of them. At that time, we also emphasized taking ownership of their own professional development and encourage them to think about their career transitions that they're having right now as a student. So for example, in those early stages, they're choosing a lab, thinking about the right working environment that fits for them, what kind of fields they might be interested in the future as well as now, and thinking about strategies also for transitioning into a new working environment or a new lab. Because when I had been at UCSF prior to this, I had done a study where we noted that students' career interests shifted a great deal around mid-stage in their training. So based on that study, what we decided to do was kind of take a deeper dive into career planning in their third year. So at this time, we offer a course now for third-year students that's focused on professionalism and research conduct. And the black ovals there are the parts that are focused on the career planning portion of this course. So the topics listed in the course are there in the gray box, things from mentoring up in terms of thinking about, what types of mentoring they need for their career, also what types of mentoring do they need for their research, how do they compose their thesis committee, how do they think about additional mentors outside of that. So we also walked them through, gave them time to, as cohorts, do some self-assessment, think through their professional identity, communicate their identity, start some career exploration, and even set goals through creating an individual development plan. So from that point onward, timed with their thesis committee meetings, because again, we want their career development to kind of be part of their holistic planning for their future, they do annual individual development plans. And we track those through our Center for Biomedical Career Development. The orange ovals are an exciting part that we added in at this later stage. So at this time, these are small group learning communities that are themed around given careers of shared interest amongst the students, or even postdocs can aim to participate here. So these career pathways communities, for them we bring in 2 professionals from outside the campus to meet with the students. They're structured and discussion-based, and we give them some structure and activities to help the discussion dive in even further. One of the activities we do in the last meeting is the students do job simulations. So they basically try on a task common to that career path. We develop these job simulations with the professionals who come into the career pathways communities. As I mentioned earlier, we need the time commitment to be very low. So you can see that even these learning communities where they're doing some real career-focused things are only a total of about 6 hours of classroom interaction time, plus their homework for their job simulation. We develop the job simulations, homework to be also very, very time efficient. So we call them micro sims because they take only about an hour, maybe 2 hours to do. What we found is that these interactions, the students are really excited about learning about different career paths and such. So one of the things we're doing is we're evaluating, this is funded through, initially as a pilot grant through the Borough's Welcome Fund Career Guidance Award mechanism, and then with an NIH Best Award. So through our Best Award, we're doing evaluation of short and long-term outcomes for this approach. And we're looking at a number of measures. One of the things we looked at was how the students felt about the requirements. As I mentioned earlier, students even push back against new requirements. But we found some really interesting qualitative data where the students are recognizing that it's actually, interesting to think ahead to their career, and they recognize how valuable it is to do early on in their training. Some of our survey or quantitative data is starting to pull out and notice trends in students, especially at mid-stage of their training, taking more career-related actions, changes in student perceptions of faculty attitudes towards different types of career paths, and also changes in our faculty's perceptions of career options for PhD students. So we have seen some interesting culture change start to happen on our campus. It's still very early. Our students who entered the beginning of this curriculum are not quite graduated yet, and so in the next couple of years as they begin to graduate, we'll be able to collect more robust data, especially on outcomes related to their transition into their next step. So our website is below. It's best.umassmed.edu, and you can find more information there, or would be really interested and happy with connecting with anyone who has questions about how to either require components of these types of things, how to offer them as opt-in opportunities, or how to look at a curriculum approach.
Oh, thank you. That was really well done. You can see how you all are developing the whole scientist and not just the lab part. So we have our final poll, very exciting. And so on building an institutional culture that values a full array of careers in the biomedical and medical workforce. How likely do you think, after hearing more about this, will your institution or you implement the things that you have heard? And while we are waiting for our poll results to come in, Cynthia, I'd like to ask, how do you add more student requirements without adding time to graduation? Because that time factor is always important.
Yeah, well, we're not at a place yet where we can measure in aggregate how time to graduation changes. But what we found is that we can have big impact in how the students, even engage themselves on networking events on our campus or in opt-in events that we also offer on our campus, simply by, messaging very consistently. You'll see that the time added into those requirements is actually very, very minimal. And so that allowed for buy-in from faculty and others on our campus. But I think even with very, very thoughtful but minimal time, you can actually have a big impact.
Thank you. That's awesome. So our polls are coming in. We have 57% of attendees are saying that, yes, they think that their institution will implement some of these strategies, which is great. And then we have 43% that just aren't sure what direction the institute is going in. So, Amanda, we'll open up our floor for questions. We don't have too much time.
We're already having it over for our webinar, but hopefully we were able to address your questions as we went. And of course, all of our speakers are very enthusiastic about the projects, as they should be, and would be happy to talk to you. So you saw their contact information throughout the webinar, and as Sandy said, those are available for download, so feel free to contact anybody with any further questions. And that's it. I'd like to thank our speakers again. Everyone, it was really informative, and thank you so much. And I look forward to our January webinar on the report on open science.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. So with that, we will conclude today's program. Please do click on the webinar evaluation link in the links box on the left side of your screen to give us your feedback on today's presentation. This session has been recorded and will be available within 3 to 5 business days, and you can access the recorded archive by using the same login information that you used for today's live webinar. On behalf of the Association of American Medical Colleges, thank you to all our speakers, and of course, thanks to all of today's participants. Have a great afternoon, and you may now disconnect.